Well, I think it's time now for you, Andy, to take the stage. I'm very much looking forward to what you're talking.
See if I can get this right this time.
Better than I hope.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to come to Amsterdam to present. This is really the idea of Gius de Koning, who invited me to sort of add a talk on this morning to speak again. Between us, we decided that something very applied on distance runners and my thoughts on how you connect the physiology, what athletes really do in training might be a good way to go and something that you might be interested in. So when I was putting this talk together, I was conscious that I wanted to expand a bit some of the topics that I raised yesterday, but equally I wasn't sure whether some of you might have been there yesterday afternoon, and I didn't want to repeat things. So there isn't very much overlap. But we're going to talk about training distance runners. Now, some of the slides are the same, and this is the obvious place to start. It's this Mike Joyner model of performance. So the physiological determinants of endurance performance. Obviously, the person that wins a race is the one that can sustain highest speed or the highest power. And that then you do a mosaic and you work out what it is that contributes to that. Equally, if you want to run a race at a particular time, then there's a particular performance velocity that's the same. So we can break it down to all of these different components. And so there's a performance VO2, a metabolic rate that you can sustain during the race. And that's going to be related to the fraction of your VO2 max, which in turn is linked to your lactic threshold or critical speed. Here's your maximum oxygen uptake or VO max. Clearly, perform at a VO2 for longer endurance events that's higher than your VO2 max. So this sets a natural ceiling. For middle distance events, and this is important too, longer distance events a bit less so. And then of course we have this efficiency or running economy, which if you like converts that metabolic rate into speed over the ground. So I thought it might be worthwhile looking at these three things: lactate threshold, VO2 max, and running economy. And we can do training. I think it makes some assumptions about what the limitations are, what the training set. Actually, this is a discussion because important. What we have here is an example of two runners and have exactly the absorption. Their VO2 max 70 mils per kilogram per minute. So exactly the same. Now, if you only knew their max, but they were equally capable submaximal speeds, then the red so it's more equal. What that actually means is that when they both run at their VO2 max of 100% of their VO2 max, 70% of the VO2 max, then for the same effort, the blue runner is traveling much faster. So same VO2 max, red runner VO2 max speed is 20, the blue VO2 max speed is 20. That's why it's important. It's related to anthropometric, physiological, and biometric in running economy between athletes than there is cycling efficiency. And that would be because with running, there are much more biomechanical variables that can influence the VO2. What we know about the optimal training is actually not that much, but longer distance athletes tend to be more economical than middle distance athletes. What we don't know is whether they were good at long distance events because they were economical in the first place, or was it because the training that they've done to prepare themselves for these long distance events has been what's provoked an improved running economy. We do know that it is plastic and it changes over many years. So I'll show you a case study in a bit with Iraq. We know many years, as long as you can train consistently, then your running economy can continue to improve. We think that accumulating a high volume of training may be pretty necessary, consistency be key, and there are some other things, possibly altitude training, certain types of strength or plyometric training have been shown, more acutely to have some effect as well. So this is Paula's economy, and I sort of tracked her over a 15-year period, really. And in 1992, when she was about 18, her running economy was about 205 mils per kilogram per kilometre, which is about average. You know, the average number is about 150 euro. You're not very economical, and the lower it gets, actually quite a smooth process. These several tests average together over each of these years, but you can see that as time goes on, she's becoming increasingly efficient. And that's whether you look at V2 at a particular running speed, or if you calculate it independent of running speed by doing mils per kilogram per kilometre. And by the time we get to 2003, she's only using 175. So that's an enormous improvement in economy. Lots of things changed during that period. She got a bit old, started to do more training, but accumulated lots of miles over many years. And presumably what happens is that both physiologically and biomechanically, you find methods, if you like, to make life a little bit easier for yourself. If you expose the body to the same stress, it's going to find ways to create shortcuts, if you will. So really quite a big improvement in running economy. What I've got here as an inset is her VO2 max over those same periods. And you can see that actually it's pretty stationary. It doesn't really change. It was 70 mils per kilogram per minute in 1992, and it was 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute in 2003. And there's a little bit of noise, but her performances continue to improve, but were totally not explained by her VO2 max, which didn't change, and were explained by the improvement in economy. So the next thing then, lactate threshold or lactate turn point. Speed, if you like, this lactates. This might be an individual training program in sort of orange color, and this is post-training. And when we view these sorts of data, we can often find a particular speed above which things start to just rise above that baseline of around millimolar. And oftentimes you can find a second, more sudden and sustained increase. So we call that the lactate threshold and the lactate turn point. Now, as you continue to train, whether this is a 6 or a 12-week or a five-year intervention, over time we find that the lactate concentration in the blood becomes lower, and that reflects in some metabolic adjustments that have occurred in the muscle cells themselves. Again, you know, if you give somebody a generic endurance training program, you tend to see this happen. But as sports scientists, we like to try to work out, well, what might be the optimal training session or overall program that might specifically target this. And I'm not sure actually we really know what that is, because most of the training studies have been quite generic training studies. Maybe this is my own judgment on thing, it reflects people's views, is that an appropriate volume of reasonably high quality training may be necessary to increase muscle mitochondrial density and capillarity, which should reduce lactate production. We also think that doing higher quality but sustained, what we call tempo running, threshold running, might be important. This is in that heavy domain between the two thresholds and just above critical speed. And that may stimulate the adaptation of the body's ability to clear that lactate. So the more you expose your organism to that kind of stressful environment, the more you'll put some sort of mechanisms in place to make that more comfortable for you. My own view is that regulating the intensity of continuous endurance exercise is really important. If you're an endurance athlete, most of your training is done in a continuous fashion, rather than you do some interval training, but probably 90% plus will be just going out for a run. Now, quite often athletes and coaches put a lot of attention into constructing their interval training programs, and they often think a little bit less about the intensity at which they do these continuous running sessions. But regulating that, I think, is quite important. So some athletes tend to go too slow and possibly would benefit from increasing the speed of it. If you go too fast, though, then you may actually diminish the years. Often that's a big proportion. So questions I got yesterday, I only had a 44-minute talk, so I believe we should talk about critical power. So I did promise that I'd say a bit about it. So here's I've got just power here against time, but this could just as easily be speed against time. And as I'm sure you're aware, exercise to exhaustion were between around 2 minutes and maybe 50 minutes. Then you can start to construct this curve, which has an asymptote. In other words, it eventually levels off. And that asymptote is shown here by this dashed horizontal line. So in this image, the critical power is about 305 watts, something like that. And what we find is that if you exercise above critical power, you've got a finite amount of energy available to you called the W prime that you expend at a particular rate. Now, once that is exhausted, you're unable to maintain that same speed. Whereas if you exercise below your critical power, you can attain a homeostasis. You can get metabolic steady states, whether it's pulmonary gas exchange, muscle phosphocreatine concentration, muscle pH, and so on. So it's pretty important in terms of dictating what is sustainable and what is not sustainable. So it represents this power or speed just above that actually sustainable rate of oxidative metabolism, and therefore is the threshold between steady and unsteady state exercise. And it's similar to sustainable metabolic rate in the Joyner calculation. So different ways of doing it. Now, the reason that's important for marathon runners is we did this sort of retrospective analysis because it's quite easy to calculate any individual runner's critical speed as long as you know their personal best performances. Now, of course, they may have done them on different times and different years, but this is the best you can do. But if you know their 1500 meters best time, 3000 meters, 5000 meters, you can calculate their critical speed and their D prime, which is the same as the W prime that they're running. And you can then also find what their best time for their marathon was. You can work out what was their average speed that they sustained during their marathon performance. And then you can work out what fraction of their critical speed they exercised at when they ran their best time. And you can see that for these elite male marathon runners, it was on average about 96%. Now, given potential error in the calculation of critical speed, I think it's quite remarkable that the fit is so tight. So these athletes seem to sort of almost intuitively know where their critical speed is, and they operate just below it. Now, as we'll come on to see, that's the average. We're going to talk a bit about resilience or durability, but we know that things like critical speed will deteriorate with time. So these athletes might start with operating at about 92% of their critical speed, but by the time they get to the end of the race, they're pretty much on it. But they have to be careful that they don't exceed their critical speed too early in the race because they'll use a lot of glycogen, they'll accumulate hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate, and so on. So they're likely to fatigue much more rapidly. So how do you improve VO2 max? That's the third thing. We've looked at running economy, lactate threshold, VO2 max equation. Just another very simple diagram here too. It's obviously an individual. Is the VO2 speed relationship. If you have a VO2 max of say 65, then that is corresponding to a running speed of 20. If you can increase your VO2 max from about 65 to about 72, then that can correspond to a significantly faster speed. There's your Fick equation, which you all know very well. Peter Wagner and others talk about the importance of the entire oxygen cascade. But we certainly know that if you can increase oxygen delivery to muscle, it appears to be able to use it. There seems to be an excess of oxidative capacity. So that's why people go to altitude, because if you can increase your hemoglobin concentration and your oxygen carrying capacity, you end up coming back to sea level with a higher VO2 max, which can be performance enhancing. So we think it's related to your maximal cardiac output, and therefore the view has been that training at near maximal heart rate and near maximal cardiac output may be a very specific way to target VO2 max. And when you do it as interval training session, then you can accumulate quite a few minutes at near maximal heart rate to stimulate that. But the issue, of course, is that if you take a sedentary person and give them any type of endurance training program, even low intensity, VO2 max will go up. So there's all sorts of crossover going on, and it may be sort of problematic just to pick out specific sessions that might be most advantageous. just a bit more on critical power and its applications to training. So the other reason why having this power-time relationship can be useful is that it allows you to calculate things like time to exhaustion at any particular severe intensity power output. Very simply, just rearrange the equation. You can also work out the power output or running speed that results in exhaustion in a particular time, rearrange it again, and you can calculate or pick a performance time for a fixed amount of work done or distance covered. So obviously, when you're constructing training programs, using this sort of computation can be very valuable. Yeah.
I was wondering, can you, if you go below critical power during the race, could you also like repush the W prime and recover a little bit?
Yeah, you do for sure. So I think that might even be the next slide. Yeah. Bit about that. So there's a guy called Phil Skeever who did his PhD with us a few years ago. He's actually an American physician, but he's also quite mathematically minded. And so when you exercise above your critical speed, you, depending on how far above it you are, you'll deplete your D prime at a particular rate, and it seems to be linear. And it was believed that if you dipped below your critical speed, then you would replenish it, and the further below it you were, the more rapidly you would. But again, the assumption was that it was linear. Turns out that isn't quite. It does seem to deplete in a linear fashion if you go at a fixed speed above your critical speed, but when you come below it, it tends to actually recover in a more exponential type fashion. So you need to know individual time constants, and there's all sorts of things that influence the recovery dynamics, including the absolute work rate, its duration, your fitness, how fatigued you are, a variety of different things. But there's a lot of work ongoing to look at that. But you certainly are able to model it. So here's power output in the black. So this is a series of intervals, and the blue is the W prime expended, and vice versa for remaining. So you can see that you dip and you recover and you dip. And depending on the duration and intensity of the work and the recovery intervals, eventually you're going to get to a W prime of 0. But you can manipulate the interval training to give you what you want, essentially. Yeah, and so it's even got to a point now where if you're actually in your bike, or maybe if you're and there's a recording of your distance and your speed, and where you are in proximity to your critical speed or critical power, you can calculate how much of your W prime or D prime is remaining. And we did publish a study in JAP. Brett Kirby is the first author, where we actually modelled what happens in, I think it was the Olympics, 5K and 10K, and you can track in almost real time what's happening to the D prime. And from quite a way out, you can determine who's going to win. Just using this, knowing what their critical speed and D prime were on the start line. And so the pacing strategy, it's not necessarily the case that the person who's best equipped to run the best possible time is the one that wins, because it depends on the pacing strategy that unfolds. So in terms of the overall training, obviously you're going to have a number of different features to it. And if you're a runner, tend to think of it as easy runs, steady runs, tempo runs, your interval training sessions. And this kind of broadly corresponds to the moderate, heavy, severe and extreme domains. The absolute amount and the relative proportion depend on the factors: how old the athlete is, what their special event is, their level of performance. As I've mentioned already, if you're presently untrained, almost any increase in any of those things will develop your endurance fitness. But presumably in the elite athlete, you have to be a bit more sophisticated. And then there's all of these other principles that we need to consider in order to evoke that sort of overload: duration, frequency, intensity, and the recovery, and to understand that there's individuality in response. And of course, sadly, training is reversible as well. The way that we've been working in this time, this is the sort of thing developed as part of my PhD, which unbelievably was about 30 years ago. Developing treadmill protocols to help runners so to evaluate their present fitness, to be able to predict what they were capable of at a variety of different distances, but also to send them away with information that they could use to monitor their training, to identify strengths and weaknesses, and to give them some ideas as how they might develop the weaknesses, strengthen the strengths as well. So this is what we end up with. So here's lactate in the red, here's running speed, here's heart rate in the blue, and this is a sort of idealized sort of relationship. But in this person, 16 kilometers per hour, you can see that blood lactate is beginning to creep up above the baseline of 1 millimolar. You can identify a lactate turn point, I think, here. And, you know, this is the moderate domain. So if you did 30 or 60 minutes of exercise below this lactate threshold at any of these speeds, lactate wouldn't rise above baseline. Very much a steady state is possible within just a couple of minutes at the start of exercise. What we also established, though, is that if you exercise between these two thresholds in the heavy domain, you find that lactate is elevated but remains stable over time. It might take 5–10 minutes to stabilize, and it might end up at 3 or 4 or 5 millimolar, but over time it stays pretty thick. So not especially stressful, but it's probably giving you more of an aerobic bang for your buck than training here. So getting that balance is important. Once you get above your lactate turn point, we did a study which shows that this broadly corresponds to the critical speed. So once you go above that speed, we find that VO2, VE, heart rate, lactate, everything is just accumulated, changing with time until you eventually hit your maximal or minimal values and become exhausted.
I was wondering, is this a representative figure? Because the heart rate is rather low with the, was it the LTP?
So this is the blue.
Oh, yeah, of course. So it's, yeah, it makes sense.
Got upset, but other than that, seems to
Yeah, the red does.
So the red is the lactate. So you end up with exercise intensity domains, which potentially are helpful for training prescriptions. Or is in moderate domain below the lactate threshold. You can describe it as relatively easy. Now, of course, that domain is really quite large for an elite athlete, because that could get quite a fraction of your VO2 max. And we tend to lump it all together as this kind of easy zone. But you know, if your lactate threshold is at 16 kilometers per hour, there's a big difference between running at 15 and running at 10. Then we have this heavy domain between these two thresholds, higher fraction of VO2 max, steady, severe, and extreme. And of course, those fractions will vary between individuals. That's why assessment is important. We find that heart rate and lactate behavior differ over time, so the dynamic. And then, if you're interested in what these intensities correspond to in terms of paces, then you can see pretty much what it's like there. So the other thing is that there's various models of intensity distribution that people have spoken about recently, and this people talk a lot about polarized training, but it seems to have become all things to all men at the moment. But this actually is what polarized training means. A lot of people now understand it to mean hard days and easy days, but for me that's a no-brainer. Everybody knows that some days are going to be harder than others, and of course you can have some medium intensity days as well. It's also been sort of confused with something called 80-20, which suggests that you do 80% of your training at a low intensity and 20% at a high intensity. And obviously, finding those overlap in the what's wrong with 9-10, 17-30. And also, so you've actually got these three areas. So why are there two numbers? Why aren't there three numbers? Shouldn't it be 60-20 or whatever? So, but theoretically, polarized really means this, that you do the bulk training here, below your lactate threshold, and you do some of it up here, and you almost deliberately avoid doing anything there. In contrast, this threshold model indicates you're training in that middle zone. And then finally, we have a sort of pyramidal where you do most of it below your lactate threshold, a considerable portion of it between thresholds, and a smaller amount of there. So it's quite interesting what athletes really do. So as I mentioned, pushed quite a bit recently. For me, personally, it seems counterintuitive because as I've showed you on the previous slide, if you're a runner, then all of your races really, everything from the marathon to the 10,000 meters, are going to be in here. if you want to perform, why would you avoid those intensities? If we believe the principle of the then it would seem to be you ought to be practicing at race pace because there will probably be physiological, neuromuscular, biomechanical, psychological advantages to so doing. Now, of course, it will depend on the type of sport that you do, especially with running. You know, I think if you're a cyclist or a cross-country skier where you can do 4 or 6 hours of training per day, you're likely to accrue a lot more training here. Runners can probably only do 90 minutes to 2 hours at the most because you just get more trauma, you get muscle, you get bashed up legs. And so you can't really afford to waste too much time going really. I have to make more of the quality given that you've got a relatively smaller amount of time to devote to your training. But there may be times in the training cycle, there may be certain advantages to use all of these times. So what we basically find, and this is a study or a graph that we put in a letter recently, which combines a whole bunch of studies. So as I mentioned, there was this suggestion that elite athletes train in a polarized fashion. But actually, it seems when you put all the studies together, it seems to be much more pyramidal. So that yes, the bulk of it is down there. They do a lot of longer, slower, lower intensity work. But then the second most trained out zone is this middle bit, and then it's this. So they actually don't seem to avoid that middle ground, and I can certainly see why. It's a misconception of how people do things. So I then just wanted to put some of this together, and this is the sort of training that some of these elite athletes really do. Some of the ones that I've worked with. So here's Paula Radcliffe, for many years the world record holder for the women's marathon. She runs about 200 kilometers per week, 125 miles. And her philosophy, she was quite bold at this point, it was tending towards France because she didn't easy, she found it very hard to run easy. And rather than run, sometimes she trained for many consecutive days and get very tired. And then rather than run very slowly, which she didn't feel was going to benefit her at all, she'd have a complete rest day, sometimes 2 rest days, and then she'd resume. So I can't remember how to do that. She did 3 higher intensity or tempo sessions per week, some weight speeds were regulated by her physiologist that we measured in the lab, and these were her specific heart rates and speeds that corresponded to that. So the principles, and that's what it sort of looks like in practice. And there's nothing wrong. People think that elite athletes train in some sort of magical way, but it's hard work. You consistently over weeks, months, years, sometimes 15 years to get to your best if you're a marathon runner. But this is the sort of thing. There's a real diet of high quality, continuous endurance exercise. Not a lot of, not very much easy running at all. Even easy, she's actually moving at a reasonably high speed. It's in 5.5 minutes. That's done at a sort of high tempo speed. 90 minutes. Where she's going in pretty good. This, the last block of before a bit of a taper, and then that's what she ran at 2:15:25. So that's what the training of an elite marathon runner looks like. I used to train with a guy called T. James. He's no relation, but we're both a member of Newport Harriers Running Club in South Wales. And he became the world record holder for the marathon as well. He ran 2:08:05 in 1985, and then ran 2:07:13 a year later, which missed the then world record by a second. And again, this is the sort of stuff that he did. And there's nothing very complicated about it. But again, there's quite high quality. You can see that every other day, Steve is doing something pretty hard. 4 times 5 minutes, 8 times 3, 16 by 1. And he's another one that didn't do a lot of easy running. When he went for a run, he did it with some purpose. So, even the steady runs were close to 5 minutes per mile. You do the calculation about 3:40 per kilometre. And then Elliot Kipchoge, obviously I spent a lot of time yesterday talking about Elliot, and I showed a particular graph at that stage. Does about 190 kilometres per week. 70% is below his marathon speed, 20% is in that middle zone, and a relatively small fraction is at faster speeds. I also mentioned yesterday that one of the key sessions for him is this one here, a long run, where they do anything up to 40 kilometers, but they do it in such a way that it's a very progressive run. It's not just go out and run for 40 kilometers at a set pace. It starts off quite easy because they've not long rolled out of bed, to be honest, and the sun's not come up, and so they start off just shuffling down the road. The first kilometre is about 5 minutes, but it doesn't take long before it starts to pick up and pick up and pick up. And probably the last kilometre is probably 3 minutes. So it gets progressively faster. Now, over the course of that 40-kilometre run, as they're becoming progressively more fatigued, they're travelling faster and faster as well. And there's probably something very specific about what that develops. And that could actually play into this durability thing, I believe. But what's important is to be able to do this week in, week out, for as many years as people like Kipchoge have. This is just an analysis that Emma did. I should mention as well that when I was editing on one occasion, they ran 40 kilometers in 2 hours and 15 minutes, and that was in full tracksuit without any taking any carbohydrates, up and down hills. You get like red clay sticking to the bottom of your shoes, and still 2 hours and 15. Well, that was just a training run. So just to summarise the part, right? To appreciate the physiological limitations and determinants of performance is what I'm looking at here. Physiological tests, lab handled with measurements via heart rate, lactate. Certainly, I think could be used to appraise athlete status. The critical power of speed, W prime, D prime, and race or training performances all provide useful information. Physiological responses to exercise differ according to those exercise intensity domains, and getting the right balance between how you program those is probably what's going to take an athlete from what they are to where they're going to go. Domains map against training intensity prescriptions. So you need to balance that total training load against the fraction of training time in those zones. So, am I okay to carry on for another 5 minutes or so? Yeah. Certainly. So, because I wanted to. So that was the kind of first bit of it, really, but I did want to then delve into something a bit newer, and that's this concept of what I am resilience or resistance. And so the point that's to make here is that the joiner model, the VO2 max lactate threshold running economy, are kind of assumed to be static. Like you measure those things in a fresh condition, bring an athlete to the lab, you measure them, and then you predict performance, and you make the assumption that they kind of fix and don't change. So we wanted to investigate whether that was really true, and this is the work of Edith Clark, who sort of did a co-sponsored PhD studentship with ourselves and Nike. So we were interested to see whether critical speed or critical power actually stays the same during endurance exercise. So this is our first study on the topic in 2018 in MSSE. We used a 3-minute all-out test to give us an indication of the critical power. So we actually asked them to do 2 hours of heavy exercise. So on one occasion, we brought them to the lab, we got them to do a 3-minute all-out test, where it's a bit like a Wingate test, but 6 times as long, and it's a hellish test to do. But what you find is that where the power output levels off is as near as down at your critical power. And the amount of work you do above that end power corresponds to your W prime. So we brought them to the lab in fresh condition, 3-minute all-out test. On another occasion, we got them in the lab and we exercised them in their heavy domain for 2 hours. And they immediately did another 3-minute all-out test. It was just on the here's what you get: fresh condition symbols, and that's the fatigue and the open symbols. You can see that. Yeah, there we go. But overall, you get about an 8% reduction in critical power. You also get about a 20% reduction in W prime, which might be another story. What's fascinating about this is, yes, on average, it's an 8% fall, which is substantial, but the inter-individual variability in that change was enormous. We got everything from about a 1% fall. So there was one individual who did 2 hours of exercise, and yet his critical power was basically unchanged. And there were others in whom critical path fell by 22%. So there's a certain, I'm calling it the fourth dimension or the fourth factor, because I think we've neglected the extent to which these things deteriorate during fatiguing exercise. So it's not just about what you've done on the start line, it's how those change. And I suspect that people like Eliud Kipchoge and Paula Radcliffe are particularly resilient, so that if you measured their running economy or their critical speed at mile 40 kilometers, it wouldn't have fallen to quite the same extent in them as it would have done for some people who are further back in the field. So I think lots should be being uncovered on this. So it's 8%, wide range 1 to 22, and this was our conclusion in that paper. Our results indicate that performance during these type of events depends not only on the value of them at baseline, but also on the extent to which they deteriorate as exercise proceeds. And quite a lot of people I think were interested in what this showed, what the implications of it were. So there's been quite a bit on it since. This is just again sort of what might happen. It shows you that on average it's about 96% in relief. So you start off feeling nice and comfortable. This is you holding your same speed, right? So which is first few miles, first few kilometers is quite comfortable, no problem. You've got this nice gap. We actually found that the critical speed, we did another study where it's actually only after about 80 minutes that it really starts to come away. So your actual critical speed is falling over this tail end. And there comes a point where there's not much of a gap when you might actually start to go from the heavy domain into the severe. So that clearly has major implications. It's probably what it's hitting the blinking, as they say in the States. So I think critical speed might fall by about 10%. So 96% on average, but it might be 92% here, but more like 100% by average. So if you want to marathon race time, you either need a higher absolute critical speed so you can operate closer to it, or you need greater resilience to prevent its forward time. So going back to Joyner's model there, that's all very well, but I would suggest a modification to it, which is that, because it's not just about these at a specific static time point, it's also how does that change, and specifically that change to change your quick speed. So this needs a bit of a modification as far as I'm concerned. Now that's studies that have sort of started to look at this, and some of them have been what you might term big data studies. So this was a group of athletes that were asked to report their threshold, what is it that they were able to sustain over the course of a full marathon. And you can see that for the first sort of 2/3 of it, they thought they were doing pretty well, but then their speed has started to fall away. They're not able to sustain it. And then this is their self-reported fraction of maximal heart rate. They were recording data as they ran. Again, first 2/3 was not too bad, but you see this progressive drift in heart rate. And of course, a sensitive index of internal and work rate ratios might be to combine them. So they called this the decoupling ratio. What's the relation between the fraction of heart rate max and the fraction of the critical speed? Again, pretty straight, about 2/3, and then it's starting to deteriorate. So this decoupling ratio might be quite a good way to start to look at it in these big events. And that was followed up by the Smith colleagues just here, 82,000 runners, and they were able to identify 3 different groups really. People who barely decoupled at all, some who moderately decoupled, and some who had this huge uncoupling, which means that either for the same heart rate, their speed was really falling off at the tail end of the race, or for the same speed, their heart rate was really going up, or a combination of the two. They're slowing down and it's becoming progressively harder to sustain. And they found that the decoupling is about 1.16, about a 16% uncoupling as the race goes on. First detected about 25 kilometers into the race, huge for individual variability. Obviously, the ones that decoupled last completed the marathon at a much faster speed, had better overall marathon performance, and also experienced decoupling much later. Interestingly, females had reduced magnitude and later occurrence of decoupling. Possibly quite know why that is, whether that's a real physiological difference or just a better ability to pace themselves. And this is just an example from, so as well as doing research, I also still work with athletes, and this is one of the best runners that the UK has got at the moment. He's injured presently, but this is Jake Smith. He doesn't mind me showing you his data. This is his lactate in the blue, his heart rate in the red. Started him at 15 kilometers per hour, and you can see that he completed 3 minutes at 23. He really is a very good runner. His lactate turn point there is 21 kilometers per hour. If you assume that he can sustain 96% of that, let's say this is broadly critical speed, we think that elite runners can exercise at 96% of their critical speed. That works out that you might suggest he could run at 20.5 kilometers per hour, 442 mile pace at a heart rate of 173 beats per minute. So let's see if that holds. So he's one of these sort of modern athletes put everything on Instagram, right? He doesn't mind sort of sharing all of his training and all of his data. And what he's been doing recently is pacing major marathons. I think he probably did Rotterdam. But these are his mile splits, and this is his heart rate. So he took the leading athletes through 17 miles, and at least 17 miles, there's no evidence at all of any uncoupling. Type 1 fibers, mitochondrial density, oxidative capacity, capillarity. I think this is an important thing, actually, the stretch shortening cycle. And if you do studies which compare East African runners with European or American runners, the VO2 max running, there's nothing really that discriminates them. And yet, when it comes to the performance, the East Africans clearly tend to win. Is it because they're more resilient? And if so, is it because they've got better stretch shortening? Certainly, there seems to be different anatomy of the Achilles tendon, which may help them. Certainly, when Kipchoge ran the race in Vienna, and I showed you that clip yesterday, he doesn't look like he's fatigued very much. He's incredibly resilient. What we don't know, so I've given you some hints as to how we think we can improve running economy, lactate threshold, and VO2 max. We haven't got a clue what it is that dictates this resilience or this fatigue resistance. So that's a whole new thing for us to start to consider. Some people are more resilient than others, but why is that the case? Are they genetically blessed? Do they do something different in training? What are the interventions that we might use as applied scientists to help them? We do know that there are some extrinsic interventions, nutrition and equipment, that may be beneficial. So there's, I think, $1 million question at the moment. We do know that if you feed people carbohydrates compared to a placebo, the fall in the critical power following 2 hours of heavy intensity exercise is very much reduced. So there's something about a loss of efficiency. You start to use more fats and it costs you more oxygen. Remember that the critical power, critical speed, corresponds to a particular metabolic rate. So if it's costing you more oxygen, then you're going to be exercising at a lower speed for that same oxygen output. So carbohydrate ingestion during high intensity endurance exercise is a must. And then I mentioned the shoe a little bit yesterday, and here's just an opportunity to expand on that. Here we have a situation where you've got people running in a regular shoe build, and then in a, like the Alphafly, the open symbols, it's about a 4% lower oxygen cost for each of these speeds. And it's a bit like that first graph I showed you on the VO2 max. If you have better economy, it means for the same VO2 max you run faster. So performance on this test. You also find you automatically get this rightward shift of the lactate profile as well. So just by lacing up a different pair of shoes, you improve your economy, you improve the speed of VO2 max, and you improve your lactate threshold essentially. So technology is certainly impacting on endurance exercise. Kind of mentioned this already, but I wonder whether this sort of run that I described is potentially important to develop fatigue resistance and resilience, but also just maintaining this level of training very, very consistently without interruption for many years. So to conclude on that bit, physiological parameters are not static, they are dynamic and they change during endurance exercise. It isn't just about the physiological status on the start line. I've been arguing that it should be considered now the fourth parameter or the fourth dimension of endurance exercise physiology. And I think there are implications for us as applied sports scientists, for the physiological testing that we do. We insist that when athletes come in for testing, they come in a fresh condition, that they've had an easy day beforehand and they're properly hydrated and have taken their carbohydrates and so on. And yet for the majority of their event, they're going to be fatigued. So maybe we ought to pay a bit more consideration to actually measuring their responses in a more fatigued condition, because that will be more reflective of what happens. And I think certainly more research is required to understand the mechanisms which underpin this concept of resilience and the interventions
that might improve it. So yeah, that was it. Thank you very much for listening.
Andy, thank you very much for a very interesting talk and for a bit of a look behind the curtains of what top level athletes do. So we were a little bit out of time, but that's no problem at all because we were all hanging on your lips, as we would say. But there is room for 1 or 2 questions.
So the thing I was struck by when I read your sports medicine paper with Annie van Hattelo, where you calculated the critical speed of elite runners, was that they can sustain that fraction of their critical speed for that duration. And I've done a few rides just below critical power myself. And although I was in a physiological steady state, I don't think I could do 2 hours at that pace. So what is it that differentiates me from those, and is it related to durability, do you think? Or is it habituation running at those speeds?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we just don't know the answers to that. I think with that big data study that I showed you, if you're not a 2-hour marathon runner, if you're more like a 2.5, 3-hour marathon runner, then you can't sustain the same fraction. Obviously, that falls down. The best runners in that group are going in about 88%. So obviously, there's a duration aspect to this as well. So performance becomes important. But yeah, I mean, and you might be one of those that is less fatigue resistant. I don't know if you've measured your critical power before and after that, but clearly what was relatively easy to begin with may have become increasingly less so for you. So either you need more headroom, or you need to practice at that, or you need to develop your resilience such that you get less of that decline at the top end.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thomas.
Thanks, Andy. I'm glad you talked a lot about power this time. Would you agree with me that, I mean, you say that it takes a long time to get to your optimal performance. Would you agree with me that we could reduce it by maybe 50% of the time if we knew what the optimal training was? And if so, what would be the most important parameter to reduce the time?
Well, the reason that it takes so long, it's obviously as you get a bit older, your VO2 max is likely to fall away. It's certainly not going to go up, because if we assume that it's at least in part related to your maximal cardiac output, and that's related to your maximal heart rate, then we know that goes down by about a beat per minute per year. So you're trying to fight against that loss of VO2 max. But it seems to be that the more training that you do over a very long period, you can still get improvements in muscle oxidative capacity. And as I showed you with Paul, your running economy improves as well. That can take a long time. So that would be if you could expedite the improvement in running economy, then it might be that you could get really elite athletes in their mid-20s rather than their early 30s. So that would be the way to do it. But I don't think we really know it. The thing at the moment seems to be do a lot of it over a long period.
I think you also showed it that there are many ways to train with the polarized training and stuff. I guess we don't know what is optimal. So I would say 99% of the people train suboptimally.
Yeah.
That means that all the performance could be a lot better if we knew how to train them. So that is, it's a lot of trial and error, and measuring until we get to the optimal for this individual athlete.
Yeah, and I do think the physiology testing helps with that. So with Paul, it was every 3 or 4 months, and most things had improved each time, but some things were lagging indicators, and it's like, well, this hasn't improved. Let's look at the training that we did in the last 3 months. Maybe you need to put a bit more focus on, and then she came back and was a bit better. So tweaking things like that probably does help a lot. each time. Yeah, she kept getting better and better. I do think though as well, there's probably not one optimal training program. You know, the example I often give is Steve Voet and Seb Coe, two of the best British middle distance runners who trained in completely different ways. Actually, Seb Coe did quite low, pretty high intensity, and never lost touch with speed. All through the winter, he could do sprints and fast intervals. Steve Voet used to do big volume, low intensity. Well, it wasn't slow, but he'd do 100+ miles per week, and then he transitioned into hill training, into speed training. And they both ran about 3:29 at the end of the day. So totally different. Almost, when I say polarised now, I mean polarised approaches, both coming to essentially the same performance. And I think even with the marathon, as long as you've got the minimum volume that's necessary for you as an athlete, for the distance you're preparing for and the performance you want to achieve, you could do anything from, I think in miles per week, from 80 miles per week to 140 miles per week. There's your sort of window. And it probably, as long as you've got that minimum in, probably doesn't matter too much. If you did more than, say, 150 miles per week, you're starting to train for an ultra marathoner, you know, and you're losing the quality. So, but the other thing though is the individual athlete's own personal preferences, because they have to enjoy it, they have to be able to persist with it. So what you think as physiologists is optimal might not be something that they would adhere to. So you have to bear that all in mind as well. It's complicated.
Final question.
I was wondering, so based on the running economy that decreased over time, do you have any biomechanical features that relate to that decrease in economy?
I mean,
loading or something else?
I mean, unfortunately, we didn't measure the biomechanics. I think if you looked at videos of her over there, certainly her running technique changed quite a bit, but how you quantify that biomechanically, I'm not sure, but I think certainly there were biomechanical changes that occurred, as well as, well, and it's hard to untangle it from the fact that she was doing a lot more training and had been training for a lot more years. So, yeah.
Could it be that, well, just maybe there's now a higher distribution of type 1 part?
Yeah.
Because that takes time to
Yeah.
really get your position and also fits with your comment.
Yeah, yeah, and we certainly speculate that on the paper. It's not just the biomechanics, I think, but you know, there are studies in trained cyclists from elites to sub-elites that show that cycling efficiency doesn't differ that much. There was the study in Lance Armstrong that showed that it seemed to improve, but that was people that know in other reasons. I agree with that. So, you know, with cycling, obviously, the technique is more similar, and so you'll be more likely to be comparing physiological differences, and the effects are quite small, whereas for running economy it's much larger, so there's more than just physiology, but I agree that could be a play a part.
All right.
Okay.
Andy, thanks again. I'm pretty sure there are a lot more questions, at least I know I have a lot more questions, but fortunately after our next 4 speakers we reserve plenty of room for discussion. Also during the lunch, I've got to mention at 11:30 we will provide you with a light lunch. But next up, as you can see on the screen, is Guus Rougoor. Guus, if I can invite you in front of the screen and I will introduce you. Guus is a lecturer and researcher at In Holland University. He's part of the Power in Sports group, and I'm hoping that I translate this correctly in English. Kracht van sport. And movement, yeah, and physical activity, I guess, yeah. And they, in their research group, they particularly focus on research participation. And in Guus' case, he's particularly interested in research participation, sports participation, sorry. And in Guus' case, he's particularly interested in people that have chronic diseases. So Guus is going to talk to us about running with rheumatic disease. Guus, floor is yours.
Yeah. So let's see if I can handle the screen.
Okay. All right. Yes. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for this introduction. It's quite an honor to be here. Also, I feel like, as we say in Dutch, a little strange duck in the bite, or otherwise said, stranger among our midst, because of the topic of my presentation, especially compared to the previous one. I'm going to stand over here, so it's a little bit more better. So as Matthijs already said, I'm interested in physical activity for people with chronic diseases, and right now we're doing a project on people with rheumatic disease, and it's a combination of running we are interested in. So
First of all, I want to give you some brief information about what it's like to have a rheumatic disease. So imagine you're on your couch and you don't know if you can go out to go for a walk because you have such an amount of pain or swollen joints, or you're not sure whether you can go for a half an hour run because you feel fatigued because of the side effects of your medicines, or you just run a 10K while your medical specialist told you not to do any physical performance because it's unsafe. So to have a rheumatic disease can be really, yes, it's hard to know what are my limits, what can be done. Rheumatic disease is divided in different types of rheumatic disease, and the one I'm focusing on is inflammatory rheumatic disease. It's a type of disease which is symptomized by pain in joints, swollen joints, all types of damage to the movement system, but the most known symptom is inflammation. And with treatment, what you do is you try to get down the inflammation, and if it's possible, for instance with medication, you see that people can be more physical active. At the same time, we see that when we look at people with inflammatory rheumatic disease, their moving and exercise behavior is quite low compared to normal population. And it's mainly also because they perform most of the time in low to moderate intensity exercise, because most of the professionals, they are cautious in advising to do more high impact sports or more high intensity sports. But it has been shown in research that it can be done safely. So therefore, although there is like interest, like people with rheumatic disease like to do more severe exercise, they're cautious, and it also has to do because of the medical people supporting them are most of the time also cautious as well, or like they don't advise them to go out and do high impact sports. And one type of high impact sports and more severe intensity sports I would like to talk about is, of course, running. Running is the second most practiced in the Netherlands. It's really easy to do it. You can take your running shoes, you go out for a run. So also, because of the health benefits of it, it would be really nice if people with rheumatic disease could perform more, do more running. But there's a lot of cautiousness possible running. And my colleague Guus who's here as well, she did a study a couple of years ago in which they compared a starting group of people with rheumatic disease to normal healthy people who started running, and they saw the same incidence of injuries, same amount of injuries in people with rheumatic disease compared to healthy ones. So there was like a sign from, well, if you do it on the right way, running can be possible. But there remain a lot of questions like, am I allowed to run? How can I start in a safe way? And not only for patients, but also for professionals. But because running is so nice, and we saw on social media groups that there's a lot of interest in this population for running. So we wanted to know, how can we make running more accessible for people with rheumatic disease? What we wanted to do is to investigate what are the risks and health benefits of running with inflammatory rheumatic disease. And in the end, our goal is to make it more accessible by developing running or materials for professionals and people with IRD to go out and go for a run. But we first needed to know, before we start to do all kinds of stuff and investigate it, or maybe do a randomized clinical trial with a running program, wanted to know, how do the different types of professionals, because there are a lot of health professionals involved in the treatment of people with rheumatic disease, how are they looking at running? What are their perceptions of the health benefits and risks? Also, what do they already give on advice or guidance? And what are the wishes and needs of the specialists? So we started a research, and we started a research project which hasn't been finished yet, in which we try to investigate what are the experience, perceptions of health risks and health benefits and wishes and needs of running with people with IRD, according to, and these are the medical specialists and sports specialists we involved in our study, which are rheumatologists, physiotherapists, rheumatic disease specialized nurse, kan je nog verpleegkundige in Dutch, podiatrists, sports physicians, running coaches, and of course, people with IRD themselves. So we chose a mixed method way to investigate it. And because we're talking about running behavior or health behavior, we used a model. It's the APA model, the Health Action Process Health Action Process approach by German health behavior professor Ralf Schweitzer, pick up specific themes which we could investigate with the patients and the professionals. We started off with a questionnaire in which we tried to find out the perceptions and the supports and needs of these two groups. But with questionnaires, the problem is you cannot go into deep. So if you want to know something about motives or ideas, you want to go into deeper. So therefore, we also did some interviews with both patients and different types of professionals. And we tried to talk more into detail about these specific themes. I will not go into deep in all of them. Time for that. But I will try to get into some first results about perceptions of the health benefits and risks of running for this group, and also the running restrictions or conditions you have to fulfill when you go running with inflammatory rheumatic disease. So that's that. First of all, the perceptions of the health benefits and risks of running. So what will happen if we go out and run? And we asked that to patients, and we used some sentences in which I had to agree or disagree, and I only will show some of the examples from our study. But when I run regularly, my overall health improves. It's like a general belief in what running can do. And we saw that like about more than 50% of the patients believe that it can improve their health. And that has also been already some indications in literature which show that. But at the same time, they believe that when they go out running, they have higher risk to get injuries or severe fatigue or joint damage. So you can imagine the doubts for people with rheumatic disease. If they go out or not, should I go? Is it safe or not? So we dive into that more deeper during the interviews. So the topic was outcomes of running, and we heard about experience outcomes and expected outcomes. We got quite some really nice stories of people who went on running and had some beneficial effects. So for instance, one I heard a couple of times is running is my medicine. Since running I have used less medication, which is really nice. Exercise is medicine. So actually turned out that it could work for this group. Of course, we also heard stories about people that crossed the borders and were fatigued for a couple of days after going out for a run. But it can have beneficial effects. And also when you look at the expectations, people are quite positive. So I think running is good for my physical condition. I think running is good for the risk of osteoporosis because of the impact it has on my joints. We also took this to the professionals, and also the professionals think in general that running can have a positive effect on this group, which is quite nice because a lot of people with rheumatic disease tend to hear from their professional, no, you should not go out for a run, it's dangerous, you will damage your joints. So there is a general belief that it can help, seeing that almost about 80% of the involved professionals agreed on this sentence. At the same time, what they're also quite agreed on is during a period of joint inflammation, people with IID are at higher risk of damaging. So when there's an inflammation in the joints, you go out running, you have the risk that you will damage your joints, and damage can be quite severe in cases of bone or joint destruction. More than 50 people agreed on that. If asked on specific risks of worsening or reducing symptoms, the symptoms you see over there, it's really hard for the professional to say whether those effects are triggered, because we deal with a really heterogenic group in which it's hard to say you will damage your joint if you go out for a run of a 10K or you run with a certain amount of speed. So therefore it's quite hard to specify the risks with running modalities. In the interviews we asked the people, like, what are your expectations of what will happen when you go out for a run? We divided it in some themes which were related with that. And the first was they discussed was there actually are some sort of goes and no-goes for running. And for instance, inflammation is an absolute no-go. Most professionals told. But also, when you go out running, it's almost essential that you will do some additional stability or strength training. You cannot go run if your musculoskeletal system is not developed. What we were hoping to find were like really some theories or ideas about what running and the impact running has on the joints can physiologically do for maybe the joint health or also the cardiovascular health. But there weren't like, although we spoke to a lot of professionals, there weren't like common theories about what running or high impact sports can especially do. And we found out that the people who had the most profound ideas about the health benefits weren't the rheumatologists, but were the physiotherapists who had the most. And those are obviously people who have the most time to go into depth about the disease. We also found out that the professionals that give the most advice and guidance on running are the people who tend to have the most, who are the ones that exercising themselves the most. So it's a little, so for instance, I'm lucky that my husband does triathlon. He's on all kinds of forums and we all have podcasts. So if there's a more self-interest in running, the chances are high that the professionals will talk about it during their consults. And we saw, what we saw is that there's a knowledge gap, although all the professionals really wanted to say more about running, but they don't have simply not enough time to dive into that. All right. Then we try to look what are the running prescriptions and conditions to enhance running behavior for people with this disease. Can we change some modalities? Are there any factors that we need to look at when people go out running? Well, first of all, we found that the professionals find it hard to say what is the exact influence of training load-related factors like frequency, distance, and speed and health benefits. So when asked this question, when advising people with inflammatory rheumatic disease, I paid particular attention to, and it weren't like factors like frequency, distance, and speed, but these were the factors that call out the most. So does somebody have inflammation? Is there an inflammation activity? is there already existing damage in the relevant joints? What kind of experience does somebody have with running? Because some professionals, they don't advise to start running when you have a rheumatic disease. Only experienced ones that already having a history of running, they like to help them with building that up with their disease. This one is a really important one. They tend to focus on how to gradually build up your running scheme. So, and what signs or signals do I have to pay attention to? Does the patient have to pay attention to when go out for running to see if they're not crossing their own borders? Knowing the focus on helping them is knowing their own limits of their body without crossing it. And when we look into the answers, like factors like frequency, pace, and distance, they weren't much mentioned. It was all about more about, hey, what is the state of the patient and how can we gradually help the patient build up running. When we look at the content of the advice, and we went deeper into that with our interviews, most of the advice and guidance they talk about is, first of all, is the person allowed to run or not? And when they take that into account, they look at several factors like inflammation state, which I already mentioned, medication, experience, pain, type of disease, whether they have unstable joints, existing joint damage, position deviations, especially of the feet and ankle, and the fitness level. Furthermore, they take into account when they give advice and guidance, whether they also should do some strength and stability training. We expected some advice on equipment, and if there's advice on equipment for people with rheumatic diseases, especially on the shoes, like the shoes Andy showed, maybe have some beneficial effect for these people. And also we spoke with some podiatrists, which are like phenomenal biomechanical analyzers. The way they look at the body is, and the way people move is, it really is quite amazing. They're able to make some orthopedic shoes or adjustments to shoes in which people move really easier. So that's what's quite nice. And it's sad that not a lot of specialists know about them. So that's another thing. So if there's any advice on equipment, it's mainly on shoes. Furthermore, advice on gradual build-up, but still we need to discover more what is a good build-up scheme. There was some advice on supervisions. So if somebody goes out and wants to become a runner, it needs supervision, but who's going to be the supervisor? That remains a question. And there was some content about whether to run in a group or not, because some people find it really motivating to run with other people with rheumatic disease, or some are just, no, I want to run on my own. It's my own. Then we spoke to some even triathlon. There was one person who did a triathlon who had an inflammatory rheumatic disease, which is quite phenomenal. And she said, no, I don't want to run in the group. I want to do it on my own. It's my own life, and I don't want to be slowed down by others. Well, yeah. How much time do we have left? 2 minutes, okay. I will skip the support and needs a little bit. So we asked also to the professional and the patient, and what do you need to enhance running behavior? I will skip this for a little bit, but we asked it also to the professionals, and basically there were like 3 main topics that were mentioned. First of all, professionals needed a good network or a good idea about who am I gonna send a patient to if he has a question on running. In the Netherlands, we have a network of physiotherapists. It's called Rheumatic, which is a network of physiotherapists who are experienced and and extra education on rheumatic disease. And those are the ones that have the most knowledge about what it is to move with a rheumatic disease. So if other specialists have questions or have a patient with a question about running, they should maybe see if they can send the person to that. We found out that all of the professionals had a really interest in running, but they simply didn't have the time to go into depth with what it is to run. So their education is needed. And also they said there's a need for information platforms for both patients and professionals. So that's something we need to keep in mind of when we want to make running more accessible for both patients and professionals. So I will finish my talk. Some conclusions we can draw from literature and this study. Running can have multiple beneficial effects for people with IRD. We spoke to some of them and they said, when I go running, it feels like I'm having an extra thing to live for. They feel more empowered next to all the side effects, the health side effects. But yeah, so people feel more like they feel a more empowered person. Running is discouraged for certain patient characteristics, with inflammation status, for instance. Sport and healthcare professionals are enthusiastic but lack knowledge about specific effects or risk of running. So that's why they maybe don't mention running, because they don't have the knowledge about it. Patients want tailor-made advice on when to run or when not to run and how to build up running. So what are we going to do with that? Quite an important question. We want to investigate more the physical and mental effects of running. So I hope I can get a scholarship to do a PhD on that. And aside, we want to develop more educational material for different sport and healthcare professionals on the health benefits and risks of running. And also, I think it's important to improve the network of professionals and know where is the knowledge about this kind of physical activity, because we can have so much beneficial effects from it. And it's also really fun to do. I used to be a quite fanatic runner, but due to some severe injuries, I quit running as well myself. But it's even harder for these kind of people, can imagine. So this is my take-home message, or like the message I want to give to you. Let's give people with rheumatic disease more confidence to extend their boundaries and physical limits. That was my presentation. Thank you all for listening. And
thank you very much. I think this was a very nice example of how you included all different stakeholders, especially the patients in your research. Since we're running a little bit behind schedule, we have room for one short question. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. So I'm obviously a big advocate for running. I think there's no better, maybe bias, right? But is there an advantage to having these people do, say, swimming and cycling in addition, so that there's less down? And then you mentioned the shoe, and I must say that, while the focus has been on the effect of the shoe on elite performance, I don't know if you've ever run in an alpha fight, but it's so beautifully cushioned that I think there are implications for getting more people more active more often, because they will feel much less damaged if they exercise in a shoe like that.
Yeah, well, the stories we heard about, we spoke with patients who went to a good shoe provider, and they were like, there's only like advantages on it. And especially when they go to a podiatrist who can even they have so much knowledge about which type of the shoe doesn't need an extra height, for instance, in it, and it can make a big difference. It can if they have an injury or a position deviation, the adjustments the podiatrist can make them start running instantly while they before weren't even able to. So it can make a big difference, I think, but it needs to be discovered more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Also a nice picture. Yes, there we go. Next up, Richie Goulding. So Richie is a postdoctoral fellow still postdoctoral fellow at at Human Movement Science, the Department of Human Movement Science. He's a applied physiologist also with a specific interest in exercise tolerance, both in healthy people but also in patients and aging people. Richard is an excellent scientist, proven yesterday when he won the excellent or outstanding paper award, I should say, about your research on training effects of people with multiple sclerosis, which won't be the topic of today. The topic of today will be aerobic function and exercise with aging. Richie, we're very much looking forward towards your talk. Happy that you're here.
Great. Thanks for the introduction.
Other way.
So today I'm going to show you some exciting preliminary data that I've collected over the last couple of years on the effects of age on exercise capacity, mitochondrial function, and morphology. So aging results in a loss of physical function, and this loss of physical function is underpinned by losses in both the maximal instantaneous power that muscles can generate and the maximal sustainable power muscles can generate. All the physiological systems that you see depicted here decline in terms of their function with age. However, which one of these predominates the loss of aerobic function, or VO2 max, across the lifespan remains somewhat unclear. Mitochondrial function has been strongly implicated in the loss of VO2 max by some authors, but human data are somewhat inconsistent. So for every study that shows a difference in mitochondrial function between young and old groups, there's another showing no differences. Mitochondria have also been strongly implicated in muscle atrophy or sarcopenia with age, but again, human data are somewhat inconsistent. So there are examples of studies where you can observe losses of muscle power and strength despite no differences in mitochondrial function. One, I guess, key theme in the field of aging is that most studies assess maximal mitochondrial function, and this can potentially conceal subtle differences in mitochondrial physiology. For instance, differences in morphology that occur with age. That's what we wanted to investigate here. So the aim of this study was to comprehensively examine exercise capacity in relation to mitochondrial function, mitochondrial density, and morphology in both young and older individuals. And to achieve this aim, we tested three central hypotheses. So you can see that. Number one, that VO2 max mitochondrial function and mitochondrial density will be reduced in older versus younger individuals. Number two, that VO2 max will be strongly related to mitochondrial function and density in both younger and older groups. And number three, that changes in mitochondrial function and density in the older group would be underscored by changes in mitochondrial morphology. Realization of these hypotheses would implicate loss of mitochondrial function as important contributors to the loss of VO2 max with age. So how do we test those hypotheses? Well, we utilize data and muscle biopsies from healthy controls that were collected as part of other ongoing projects. And we split our healthy control groups into younger and older subjects. All subjects, however, underwent the same ramp incremental exercise testing procedures, as well as on a separate day, a skeletal muscle biopsy, the vastus lateralis. During the exercise testing, we of course measured gas exchange and ventilation. We also measured muscle deoxygenation by near-infrared spectroscopy, but I won't be showing that data today. And from the muscle biopsy, we assess mitochondrial function via high-resolution respirometry, and we assess mitochondrial density and morphology by transmission electron microscopy. So this table here just gives you an idea about the descriptive characteristics of the group. So of course, by design, groups differed in terms of age, but with respect to every other descriptive characteristic, the groups were relatively similar, or they didn't differ significantly, indicating that the groups were relatively well matched. Okay. So what do we find? We first looked at exercise tolerance and the in vivo aerobic function. So you can see here that maximal oxygen uptake was significantly different between groups, consistent with previous work. We didn't find differences in the peak power attained on the incremental test, but when we normalized this as a function of body weight, the older group performed significantly poorer. So
This confirms that exercise capacity, when normalized by body weight, was indeed lower in the older groups. We saw a lower gas exchange threshold in the older individuals. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we saw a reduction in maximal heart rate, but the sub-maximal cardiac function is indicated by the VO2 heart rate slope didn't differ between the two groups. We didn't see any differences in ventilatory efficiency or peak ventilation during exercise, indicating that there was no obvious sign of respiratory impairment in these subjects. So we next looked at the muscle fiber cross-sectional area and SEH activity. So you can see here, there was no difference in the average fiber cross-sectional area between the two groups, and I think this is an important finding because it suggests that any mitochondrial changes that we observed subsequently occurred prior to any age-related loss of muscle size or atrophy. We did, however, see a reduction in SDH activity in the older individuals, indicating that these subjects did experience a loss of oxidative enzyme activity with age. We have imaged all biopsies for fiber type, but we haven't analysed that yet. So in order to get an indication of what might be going on there, what's going on here? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I rank ordered all of the fibers in terms of their SDH activity within each individual from lowest to highest, and then I created two categories. So I classified the 10 fibers with the lowest SDH activity as low oxidative fibers. I classified the 10 fibers with the highest SDH activity as highly oxidative fibers. In this analysis, we found that there were no differences in the cross-sectional area in the least oxidative fibers, and also no differences in their SDH activity. In contrast, when we looked at the highly oxidative fibers, there were no differences in cross-sectional area again, but what they did show a lower oxidative activity, enzyme activity in the older group. So this is an interesting preliminary finding, but of course we're going to follow this up with fiber type specific SDH activity in our analysis. We next assessed mitochondrial function via high resolution respirometry and permeabilized skeletal muscle fibers. So what you see depicted here is mitochondrial respiration or oxygen consumption in 5 different respiratory states, so with different substrate combinations. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of them and explain what they are, but important ones, for instance, are the oxidative capacity, the electron transport system capacity. But across the board, we didn't see any differences in mitochondrial function for any respiratory state. I think this is interesting because the older subject did display a lower VO2 max. So this suggests that in these subjects, a reduction in mitochondrial function cannot explain the reduced VO2 max. I then assessed mitochondrial density and morphology via transmission electron microscopy. So just to give you an idea about this analysis, we cut ultra-thin longitudinal sections of muscle fibers, and then we image single fibers, and we take images from the substernal region and the intermyofibrillar region. Haven't finalized the results of the substernal region yet, so I'm only going to show you the intermyofibrillar results today. But we take images at a magnification of 18,500, where we of the intermyofibrillar region, where we quantify muscle mitochondrial density and morphology. We image 4 fibers per subject, and we have 4 images per fiber, resulting in 16 images per subject. So that means that the data that I show you are comprised from estimates from around 6,500 individual mitochondrial profiles. So the analysis is about as fun as it sounds. So what you see here is consistent with our mitochondrial function data. We didn't see any differences in mitochondrial density between the two groups. But we did see differences in the way that mitochondrial density was comprised. So older subjects had, on average, smaller mitochondria that were more numerous. So these data showed that estimates of maximal mitochondrial function or mitochondrial density conceal age-related changes in mitochondrial physiology. We then assessed the relationships with age, and we found that there was a strong inverse linear relationship between the average mitochondrial size and age, suggesting that as we get older, our mitochondria get smaller. And we also found a positive relationship between the number of mitochondria per micrometer squared and age, suggesting that maybe to offset reductions in mitochondrial size as we get older, to maintain mitochondrial function, they become more numerous. We then looked at some descriptors of mitochondrial morphology. So descriptors that were related to mitochondrial size, so perimeter of mitochondria, the maximal and minimal ferrous diameter, and the perimeter to area ratio all differed with age. But the shape descriptors, so circularity, the aspect ratio, so the ratio of their height to width, did not differ. This tells us that whilst our mitochondria get smaller with age, they don't tend to differ in terms of shape. One, I guess, issue with ex vivo respiration in permeabilized fibers is that each sample has a different mitochondrial density. That's related to, or can be related to, sampling variability. So to get around, this can affect the results. So to get around that, one thing that's been suggested is to normalize respiration data by mitochondrial density. And it's also been suggested that this gives an estimate of intrinsic mitochondrial function, or respiration per mitochondrion. That's the analysis that I performed here. Again, we've got 5 different respiratory states. The intrinsic oxidative capacity here, the intrinsic electron transport capacity here. But again, across the board, we didn't see any differences in intrinsic mitochondrial respiration. So this suggests that the morphological changes that we saw in the elderly individuals didn't have an effect on intrinsic mitochondrial function. Finally, we looked at which variables related to mitochondrial content and function were related to VO2 max between the two groups. So what you can see here is the relationship between VO2 max and oxidative capacity assessed via respirometry, SDH activity, or the average SDH activity of all fibers, and the SDH activity of the most oxidative fibers. The old group is shown in the black circles and the young group shown in the white circles. So VO2 max was strongly related to markers of mitochondrial function and content in the young group, but these relationships were not significant in the older group. This could reflect the fact that there was a reduced range of VO2 max values in the elderly. That's just a natural consequence of aging, but it could also indicate that alternatively, processes related to convective or diffusive oxygen delivery might pose a more important restraint on VO2 max in subjects. So just to summarize our presentation, older subjects displayed a reduced VO2 max when compared to younger subjects, consistent with previous work. Despite the reduced VO2 max, older and younger subjects had a similar mitochondrial density and function, suggesting that mitochondrial differences do not explain the differences in exercise capacity that we see between these subjects. The markers of mitochondrial function and content were correlated with VO2 max in the young subjects, but not in the older subjects, perhaps suggesting that oxygen delivery is a more important constraint to VO2 max in these subjects. Despite identical mitochondrial function and content, the older subject displayed smaller and more numerous mitochondria, consistent with a pro-fission state in muscle or fragmentation of the mitochondrial network. These findings might therefore suggest that alterations in mitochondrial morphology precede over mitochondrial dysfunction that occurs with age. Thanks for listening. Thanks to all my collaborators that you see here who are important in carrying out this project. And happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very nice example of how, fundamental science can explain a very natural process, and at least shed some light on why the hell I am still getting slower and slower and slower, right? The older you become, the better you were, right? There is room for 1 or 2 questions.
equally sedentary? Because obviously as you get a bit older, you
Yeah.
become a bit less active, and that may explain part.
We didn't have an objective measure of physical activity, but using a subjective questionnaire, they were equally active. So yeah.
You know, there's this old concept of simorphosis, where everything kind of
Yeah.
improves or degrades in parallel. And, you know, were you able to do correlations with things like maximal cardiac output and VO2 max? Because just because something was correlated doesn't mean necessarily, you know, lots of other things might have been correlated as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, we didn't have any data on cardiac output. But yeah, it's interesting. I think, of course, the fact that mitochondrial density and VO2 max are correlated in the young group doesn't mean that mitochondrial density is limiting. But as you said, it might imply that there's some, simorphosis going on. I think the interesting thing is that in the older groups, they're not correlated. And I showed the presentation yesterday in MS patients, they're not correlated there either. So, yeah, I don't know why that is the case, but, perhaps the physical impairments that occur with age or in certain diseases happen at different rates in different individuals, accounting for why all the structures are not impaired in symmetrical fashion. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds sensible.
Well, if you to max, you normalize for body weight.
Yeah.
How are these two groups, were they different in anthropometry?
No, so, they didn't differ significantly for body weight or BMI.
Lean body mass? Lean body mass?
We didn't measure that.
Okay, so I think there's...
Yeah. But I mean, across the series of anthropometric measures we have, so weight, BMI, and fibre cross-sectional area as well, they weren't different. So, yeah, I would suggest,
Well, okay, but if your fat content is higher, then it could affect your VO2 max, your whole body.
yeah, it's a fair point. But yeah, we didn't measure that in these subjects. So.
More room for discussion, I see. I am going to. Am I going in the wrong direction?
Oh yeah, I had like just a discussion slide, but you can skip that.
Yeah, there we are. So the next speaker I want to invite is Michel de Haan. So Michel is a PhD candidate at the Department of Human Science as well, and but he's mostly based in Eindhoven, where he works with top-level football players and top-level swimmers. And today, I think you're going to speak about top-level football players, right? And also about the challenge of concurrently improving your sprint and your endurance capacities. Michel's also an award winner, so he's the second award winner today because yesterday he won the poster award. And I think you're going to expand on your poster today.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for the introduction.
So I'm going to be talking about running as well, more in like a game setting, so in like a soccer setting. I'm mostly focused on the sprint and endurance side, and also taking into account the playing positions. Little bit of background on soccer. So in soccer, it's very important to be able to combine both the sprint and the endurance capacity, because you need to be able to win the duel. The small differences in speed can determine if you do or don't get the ball and to have an opportunity to score or not. And you do have to do this for 90 minutes, so it's multiple consecutive sprints back to back to back. However, we found in different sports that it's very difficult to be able to combine both this sprint and this endurance capacity. So we wanted to do is find out if this relationship was also existent in soccer and in the young elite soccer. So in order to do that, we had two groups of under 21 and under 18 players of an elite soccer team, and we made them, they participated in a study where they both did a sprint measurement, a 20-meter sprint measured with local position measurement, and a VO2 max test.
And here you see them sprinting, and there's cameras that know exactly where their lines are, where they're sprinting, so we know exactly the speed they're running at. And we do VO2 max testing.
That's it. That's it.
To get what we found is that there is no relationship between this maximal sprint and endurance capacity in these young elite soccer players. Here you see the average speed on the first 5 meters of the sprint and the normalized VO2 max, and you see no actual relationship. We would have expected an inverse relationship to be. A possible explanation for this is that it's just a homogeneous group of players. They all both need to sprint and have the endurance capacity. And it could be that like an endurance runner would be all the way at the top here, and an actual sprinter would be at the bottom there to create this inverse relationship. And this is like a cloud in the middle. To investigate this further, we looked at the different playing positions, because you would have expect that a forward would be sprinting a whole lot more than a central defender. So you would expect the group to be like kind of differing in physiological profile. So we looked at these 5 different positions, and we looked at the capacities that they showed on the sprint and endurance tests and the combined Z-score of these 2 tests. And we found that there's no significant difference between any of these groups, which was surprising, because you would imagine that these different tasks in the game would result in different capacities. So in order to test that hypothesis to see if there actually is a significant difference in a match, or that all soccer players are basically doing the same thing, we looked at match performance data. All the big stadiums in the Netherlands have camera systems that show exactly where the players are running during the match. And using this data over 2 seasons, we found that there are significant differences in physical match performance. So we do see that there's differences in total running speed, in high intensity running speed, and in total sprint distance between these groups. And mostly you can see that midfielders are the ones running the most total distance, and that forwards, but also backs, are the ones sprinting the most during the match. Mostly because the backs are playing the outside, and in modern football, backs are also attacking a lot, and they have to sprint back with the forwards and fight that duel for the ball. So they basically need the same sprint capacity as the forwards, but they also have the distance in the whole side of the field. So to look better into this, because now there's like a mismatch between what you would expect there to be in a match and what there is in that capacity. So what we did is we put these 2 against each other and looked at the average speed on the 20 meters and then their total sprint distance. And logically, you would assume that the fastest sprinter would also be the one utilizing this the most in a match. We found that there's no relationship here either. So not the ones that are sprinting the fastest are not necessarily the ones sprinting the most during a match. And the same thing we found for the endurance side. So the ones that have the highest normalized VO2 max were not the ones running the most distance at moderate or high intensity. So there's this mismatch where the coaches need to either look at the players and see if this person that's running a lot at moderate to high intensity distance, that they either need to up their capacity or maybe they need to be utilized differently during a match. In order to help the coaches in identifying which player groups should be trained or utilized in a different way, we used clustering, which means machine learning, and we used so the capacity tests, so sprint speed and the variables from the treadmill, and the variables we got from the match performance. And we try to identify different groups who have either an undercapacity or an overcapacity compared to their match performance. And then it's up to the coaches to then determine if we find that they're in a group that has an undercapacity, do you either want to train these individuals more specifically on, for example, their sprint speed to better match their performance, or do you want to exploit them differently in a match, maybe put them in a different position or utilize them a little bit different strategically? So to conclude, we found that there's no different inverse relationship between maximal sprint and endurance capacity in this group of young elite soccer players. We found that these physical capabilities that they show in maximal sprint and maximal endurance tests do not necessarily line up with the performance that they show in the matches. And we provided the coaches with a new model to cluster the individual groups to give them better insight in either whether these players have an over or an under capacity compared to their match performance. And the coaches can then use this to give them cues to better personalize the training towards their needs or to better exploit them during the match. That was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Michel. I think that was a nice example of how two different fields of expertise, namely data science and physiology, meet and come up with new solutions. So the paper is open for questions.
What was the age of these young players?
So it was under 21, under 18, so it was 16 to 18, and the average age was about exactly 18.
Did you look up their player history if they performed already like for a specific time in that type of position on the field?
So most of these players had already like kind of specialized into their own position.
Right.
So they are like actual, and there were a few that played about like 70% of the games in one position and 30 in the other, and then we used the overall most one.
Yeah, because otherwise I could imagine that they just haven't adapted yet to their specific position, but they already performed quite well.
They were used the ones that were.
Yeah, really interesting. So you measured this 5 meter. There was no relationship between 5 meter sprint and VO2 max, but the 5 meter sprint is more of a measure of anaerobic power. I wonder if you'd speculate whether that you might get this inverse relationship between VO2 max or an index of endurance fitness and anaerobic capacity. So if you've done something like a 200 meter sprint rather than a 5 meter sprint, do you think that might have teased out?
So we have looked at the 20 meter and we did not find an inverse relationship there either. And the reason we went for 5 is because we saw that most of the variability in their 20 meter performance came from that first 5 meters, and it's the biggest, like I guess, like power performance the first 5 meters. So you get like a real like explosive measurement against a real endurance measurement. Whether the 200 meter would possibly. I think that for soccer though, it is where they never sprint a 200 meters, so we went with a representative distance.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? So you showed, you showed that there's no match, right, between physiological characteristics and match behavior.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm a bit biased by the impressive data from Kipchoge and Radcliffe that I saw. But if you look at the game demands, they're actually, well, at least compared to those performances, not that impressive, right? It's we're running 12 or 10 kilometers in 90 minutes, running over 14 kilometers per hour. Of course, it's tiresome and not for the average person, but still. So could it be that irrespective of the physiological characteristics of the player, the game demands are well within their physiological range, and could that be a reason that you do not find a match?
Yeah, we've talked about this with the coaches as well, because one of the trainers had an idea that soccer players should just have like a baseline capacity, and then they would just be able to play every position correctly. However, we've seen like players like Messi, who run about 6 kilometers in a game compared to other players that run about 12 kilometers a game, and you can see how well that works. And maybe there is right now a baseline capacity because maybe they train each one of these players like the same way because they're training as a team and not very individualized. But maybe that is the reason why we don't find it. But maybe we should be able to find it because they should focus more on the actual sprint capacity and see if that can really help better the performance and not just create an overall shape performance.
One final question.
I'm wondering what the results tell you about the validity of your test of sprint speed.
You mean that it's not representative of their sprint speed in the match?
Yep. And even when you show the video of them sprinting, they don't look like they're sprinting. They look pretty like they're taking it pretty easy.
I was there, but they really tried that, and they did multiple tests. But
they did multiple tests of sprint speed.
Yeah, like what, 2?
And you take the average.
No, we just did the fastest one. So we did 2, and they. I mean, I can never say that they went full all out, but they were supposed to, and the coaches instructed them to, and I was there, and it looked.
Then if you're on the ground, you've got a ball, you've got an opponent, you've got maybe an audience, maybe not please.
It's a valid question because in match, of course, this is a straight line running speed, and in a match, often they change distance, and this could influence like maybe they do react very well left and right, and their actual like 20-meter sprint speed is not that high, but because they are very agile, that they can utilize that better in the game. That's true. We can look further into that and see if we can optimize and also incorporate like agility kind of testing into these studies. But yeah, it's a valid question.
All right. Michel, thanks again. Here's our last but not least speaker, Jens Voet. And Jens is also a PhD candidate, also a busy part of the human movement sciences. And what's particularly interesting about Jens is that he's not only a PhD candidate, but he's also a trainer at the Solar Medic. Yeah, I try to remember it. Sorry about it. A continental semi-professional or maybe professional cycling team, which puts him in a unique position that he's well between his subjects. So Jens is going to talk to us about cycling performance after accumulated load. Also, I think a result of the fact that you could be present there during training, also during the whole season. And we're very curious about your presentation. Jens, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks for introducing me. As Matthijs told, I'm gonna tell something about my PhD project into cycling performance after accumulated load. But before I want to introduce myself a bit more, I want to start with a quick example of imagine we have 2 cyclists, and this is the first cyclist, 10 years old, has 70.5 kilos of weight, and he can do the average power in a testing protocol over 10 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes. The following power outputs divided by his weight. And then we have cyclist 2, that's 27 years old, but it's the same weight, and he can do the following power output over these durations. So if you see this data, you would have to guess a performance level of those cyclists. You would probably say that cyclist 1 is a better cyclist, I guess. But now I'm going to tell you that cyclist 1 is not even a professional rider yet, and cyclist 2 finished second in the Giro d'Italia. So that's quite remarkable. So what could be an explanation for this? There have already been a few hints already in the previous presentation, but I will come back to that later. First, I want to introduce myself a bit more. So as Matthijs told, I'm a trainer for Rougoor, which is a continental cycling team on semi-professional level. So they're already training and living like a professional cyclist, to be honest, but they don't get paid yet as one. But they really try to reach that level. So Most of the cyclists in our team are really talented and try to reach professional level. And mostly every year we have one or two cyclists that can make it into the level. Next to that, I'm a PhD candidate here on the Faculty of Human Movement Sciences, where I do research into talent development in cycling, where I also look at the last step towards professional level. So we also look at our participants as part of the team, so we can combine practice and theory. And actually, it's a pretty good combination of the things we see on training sessions in practice we can immediately use in the scientific research, and the outcomes of the research can immediately be used in practice as well. So let's head back to our example. I'll explain a bit. The first cyclist is a cyclist part of our team. And the second cyclist is data from Tom Dumoulin finishing second in the Giro. So why does it look like the first cyclist is already performing better? Therefore, I want to give some more information about the structure of a cycling race. So here you see an altitude profile of a stage in the Tour de France last year. As you can see, there are already a lot of climbs before the final climb. So the final climb is here, and mostly on the last climb, or sometimes in the climb before, the race really decided. So in the beginning of the race, it's not really mattering what you can produce as power output, you just have to follow the group. And at the end, at the last climb, there the performance is made. So it doesn't really matter what you can produce as power output here, because the race is not decisive over there. But it is after some accumulating climbs and load, and you're a bit tired, but you can still produce that is much more important. And you can make a term for this, and it's durability. And one of my supervisors published a nice study on this. So they had a huge data set of professional cyclists, and they divided the data set into the winners of the team and the helpers. So the winners were, of course, at a higher performance level. And then they looked at the power output in races, and they standardized it based on their best power output in the race, and then looked at it again after accumulating load levels. So if they produce such a load and load and load, so till the end of the race, or what they are still able to produce at the end of the race. And as you can see in the beginning, there's not much of a difference between those levels, and how much more load they accumulated, the difference were larger. So therefore, it's seen as a performance indicator into cycling races, what you're still able to produce after accumulated load. So that leads to our research question, and you are really interested in, okay, well, we see this happening in races, but what is underlying on this? How can we maybe predict this, or how does it change during the season? Is there an effect of the moment in the season we are busy with? So that's what we want to investigate. And also important, we want to set up a standardized testing protocol, because in the previous slide you saw some data from races, but if you are a bit of a criticism, then you could say like, oh, but the race winners, they were like chilling in the beginning of the race, and at the end of the race they had much more energy provided. So therefore we want to standardize testing protocols to exclude this. We did this with 16 semi-professional cyclists, so there were cyclists of our team. So they were like already on a pretty well-trained level and mostly training 18 to 20 hours a week. We did 3 months into a cycling season. As a short explanation, so in October they are mostly have a resting period after the previous season, and they mostly do nothing or just a bit. Yeah, we have the period from November until February where they are only training. So they mostly do training sessions but not do races yet, and they are preparing for the next season. So we want to see the effect of just the training period. So we did one in the beginning of the preseason and also at the end of the preseason to see what this training does. And then we also wanted to see, like, if they start the race and they do a lot of race and the racing season is pretty long in cycling, what it does to the durability. So therefore, we also included the testing moment at the beginning of July. And during the testing days we had, the participants came to our lab for a pretty long day, as to say. And we started with a test in a fresh state. And we looked at several things. We did an efficiency measurement where they did a submaximal effort on 6 minutes of 55% of peak power output and 6 minutes on 65% of peak power output. And in these measurements, we calculated gross efficiency and the use of fat and carbohydrate oxidation. And next to that, this was immediately used as a warm-up for the power profile, where the participants did a 1 minute and a 10-minute all-out time trial to have a measure of performance. So this took around 45 minutes. Then they went outside for a 3-hour cycling ride at a certain load level, and we used this power output to have a bit of the similar power output and the similar load at the end of the day, which they would also have in the race they do. And then they came back into our lab again, and they repeated the same test. So we did the same test as in the first state, but then in a fatigue state, to compare those two. So let's head over to our results. Here you can see the result of the 1 minute average power, so the performance variables with the power on the left side, and here the season periods we tested in. The brackets show the significant differences. And as you can see, so the 1 minute average power was decreased in a fatigue state on all occasions, but the difference was not really different between the testing periods. And for the 10-minute average power, there was not a decrease of performance in fatigue state. So some riders even performed better after they went out for endurance ride, came back into the lab, and they even performed better on the 10-minute power output. So what we saw is that the 10-minute power output was improved a lot during the season. So the difference between the first occasion in December and the last occasion in July was much larger than we saw with the 1 minute power. Now we also had a look at the gross efficiency, and there was a bit of the same look as the 10-minute power output. So there was not a difference between the first and the fatigue state, but there was some improvement throughout the season, especially in the fatigue state. We saw them improving. And then the fat oxidation. So the fat oxidation was higher in the fatigue state than it was in the fresh state. But the differences between fresh and fatigue became smaller throughout the season. And actually the same could be said about carbohydrate and the other way around. So the carbohydrate oxidation was lower in the fatigue state, at maximal level, but throughout the season, the difference between those two became small. So to rub it all around, so we saw some decrement in the short power output efforts, but not in the longer power output efforts. So probably the short efforts are more impaired by fatigue state. And we didn't saw a decreased efficiency, what we would expect on beforehand, as we saw in some other studies. And maybe it was because the protocol was hard, so they were really tired after the day. But during the 3-hour ride, they just did an endurance ride, so there were no high intensity efforts or something in between. And maybe that led to no decreased efficiency, or they were just on a very high performance level. That could also be the case. Then we saw a higher fat oxidation and a lower carbohydrate oxidation. This was also already seen in previous study, that after an accumulated load, there was a higher fat oxidation and a lower carbohydrate oxidation. But in that study, they didn't provide them with nutrition. And because our testing here was pretty long, we provided them with a standardized nutrition of 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So there's like not only an effect of nutrition, but probably there's something more that does something with the substrate oxidation. And then during the season, we saw like with the 1 and a 10-minute go the other way around. So probably the short effort is not much improving throughout the season, but it's more the longer effort and a kind of endurance capacity that's improving throughout the season, especially also still in the racing season. And we saw actually the same for the efficiency. So again, improve for the endurance capacity, more improving throughout the season. And we saw some new aspects for the fat oxidation, that the difference between the fat oxidation became smaller. And to be honest, we're not yet really sure why this is happening or why this should be happening. So, as I told you before, I'm really lucky that I immediately can use this in practice as well and not have to wait for the data to be published, as we have the data ourselves. So how we're going to use this in practice, I think for me the most important thing is to see that also in the racing season, where there's much less time for recovery and much less time for training, because they do a lot of races almost every week, but there's still an effect on the durability side. So maybe not on the maximal power output values, but it is on the durability side, which is quite interesting for me to know as a trainer. And what is also important for me is that there's something in the maintaining of the carbohydrate oxidation to maintain performance, and I believe it's more than only nutrition, and that's, I think, something quite important to use in the training phase as well. So what's next? I just showed you a small part of my PhD research, but there's more hopefully coming up. So are there other predictors for durability? So is it maybe possible to already predict durability from like fresh state tests, so we don't have to get scientists into the lab for a whole day of testing, and maybe can do it with a smaller test, just 1 hour or something? And how can durability improve by training, which is still, I think, an important question to arise. And is there different ways of training, as we already saw with the race? Is there like a different training load or something that durability is more improved than other things? So as a few takeaways, that we saw that the power output of short periods is more affected by accumulated load than over longer periods, but at the longer periods and endurance capacity is more improved throughout the season. And that substrate oxidation seems to change after accumulated load and during the cycling season, and therefore plays an important role in the durability side. So thank you for listening, and more than happy to answer.
Thank you very much for your talk. So at AISS we always try to integrate science into the practice of sport and physical activity as best as we can, and you're the personalization of that, so congratulations on that. Are there any questions for Jet? I have a question. So you mentioned that there's a change in substrate utilization after extended period of training, right?
Yeah.
How did you measure that? How did you assess that?
So
how did you measure whether they were using fat or carbohydrates?
oh, we based it on the oxygen uptake. Yeah, oxygen and carbon on the CO2 uptake.
And could it be also an artifact of breathing then, what you're measuring, or how sure are you that it's indeed substrate utilization that you're measuring?
Not 100% sure. It could have something to do with breathing as well. Yeah, pretty sure. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions?
Just following up on that question, I thought for me that was one of the more striking things, because people have speculated that better durability or resilience is related to a better ability to metabolize fat. And in fact, you're showing it's quite the opposite. And we do know that there's a lower oxygen cost of resynthesizing ATP when you use carbohydrate compared to fat. So I think the change in the substrate utilization is having a direct impact on the efficiency, and it's the change in the efficiency which is then impacting the durability. So I thought that was a really important finding. But just on the power output being more sensitive in a 1 minute test than a 10-minute test after accumulated load, that kind of fits with our work on the critical power and W prime.
Yeah.
So the critical power fell by 8 to 10% in a series of studies, but W prime has fallen by 20% on average, and again there's variability around that. So whether that's to do, you're going into that 1 minute test with a lot less glycogen, so your ability to generate energy, through anaerobic glycolysis is going to be impaired. But there's a lot of consistencies and lots of new and novelties in what you showed there. So very, very well done.
Yeah, and also on the 1 minute test there was like no participant at all that improved throughout in fatigue state. Well, in the 10 minute there was much more variation as well. And,
can you tell us a little bit more about this variation between seconds, between responses? So like, did everyone have the same trend, or were there also?
No, there was a lot of variation, and we're still looking into like why is this variation happening. To be honest, I believe there's also quite some effect of the mental part to be able to replicate the maximum effort all the time.
Well, at least the 3 minute all-out test, right?
It's easier, but still it's like 4 times going all out in a day, and we just have some participants that could just get all out and fall off their bike after a test, but not all of them. So I think there's also something important, but it's quite hard to measure something of mental toughness or capacity in that, I think.
It's quite amazing that some people are able to do 3 hours of exercise and do better in a day. How do you explain that?
Like partly maybe because also the 10 minute test was also at the end, so it was like the last one. So then I'm coming back to the mental part again. So they're still, although they went all out, I think like unconscious there's still a bit of a pacing into their minds.
And what was the gap between the 1 minute test and the 10 minute test?
At 10 minutes. So yeah. So it could in that way also be that if you have a higher anaerobic power output in the 1 minute test, that the recovery is less.
Yeah.
And in the fatigue state, so you're not possible anymore to produce high power in the 1 minute, so therefore the recovery is better.
There's also the possibility to ask the other presenters a question if you still have a pressing question. Are there any questions online? Because people online can also ask questions. If not, I would suggest that we will continue our discussion during lunch. If the caterer can actually find his location.
Yeah, we already need a lunch set up.
There is a lunch, great.
So we can grab a...
And there are 2 more important messages. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers. Thank you very much.